Welcome to our class. In this class, we will look at how to connect to the database. There are three ways that we can create a connection to the database using PHP. Traditionally, the MySQL extensions was one way. That has been deprecated as of PHP 5.5, so that will not be covered. It is just for your information. There are two main ways that are commonly used. One is with what is called PDO, PHP Data Objects. This is an object-oriented approach. There are two other ways using MySQLi. The I stands for improved, and that is the newer version of the older MySQL extensions. The MySQLi is an object-oriented approach and a procedural approach. So we will look at how we connect in these different manners. If you are using the traditional MySQL extensions, what we need to do is we need to connect to the database. And this is how you would do it using these built-in functions. With PDO, because it is object-oriented, we need to create a new instance of the PDO object, and we store it in a variable called CONN. This is a popular variable name for the connection. With the MySQLi, which is also object-oriented, we also are creating a new instance of that object. With the MySQLi procedural, we are executing this function. So the object-oriented approach uses methods and properties. The procedural uses functions. So the first thing you need to do is you need to create a connection to the database. In order to retrieve the data or to display it on the web page, also if you are going to insert or update the data, you always will need a connection. You might hear the term connection string being used. In a typical database-driven website, you would be accessing the database on multiple web pages, and you can use the same connection string on all of the pages. So, generally speaking, there are approximately 6 steps involved in connecting and displaying data from a database. First, you need to establish the connection. Then you need to set up your SQL query, what you want to show. Then you need to execute that query as a result set. You'll always want to be testing along the way. And then you would loop through it as an associative array to display the results on the web page. Ultimately, you'll always close the connection when you're finished. So let's take a look at how we would establish the connection using MySQLi. First, we see the object-oriented approach. Here we have the object, the MySQL object, and we have the new keyword. This object takes 4 parameters: the server name, the username, the password, and the name of the database. The server name for us would be localhost. If you were using a server on the website, that would probably be given to you, or you would be setting up the connection a different way using their procedure. In our case, the username is root and there is no password, and then the name of the database. Should you use the procedural MySQLi, you would be using the MySQLi_connect function, which would take those same 4 parameters. Now you can hard code the names in there, or you can set up variables. So this is a little bit more efficient. Here we have the object-oriented approach where we're storing the values in the variables, and when we set up the connection object, we are using the variable names. Establishing a connection using PDO. The same principles apply. This is object-oriented. We need to set up a new instance of this object, the PDO object. However, in this case, the PDO object takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is the DSN. That is the data source name. That is a little bit different from what we've just seen. The next 2 parameters are the username and the password. You will always be sending a username and the password, and you probably want to set up a unique username and password and only have certain people have access to that for your database connection. The data source name. One reason why you might decide to use PDO rather than MySQL is that PDO can connect to any database. It could connect to an SQL server, Microsoft database, an Access database, an Oracle database. The MySQL extensions, or the object-oriented approaches, only work with the MySQL database. So this is one reason why PDO might be used other than the MySQL. So for the data source name, you need to indicate the type of database, the name of the database, the type, the host or the server, and the name of the database. So here's an example where we're storing the values in variables, and here you can see we have a relatively elaborate string for the DSN, and here we have our username and root, and here we see our connection object being created. A common approach to working with the connection is to store it in a separate file and call it using an include or require. We have looked at these procedures in the past. This way, rather than writing the same code all the time, you can store it in one file and therefore call it from every page you need it. This is a lot more efficient also for maintenance purposes. Okay, you always want to test the connection first. Don't assume that you have it. And you can wrap that inside of an if-else. And because we are working with the object-oriented approach here, MySQL object-oriented, we're working with methods and properties, and we've already established the connection object. How you call a property on a connection object is with this operator, the hyphen and the greater than sign. That is the operator. It's not a dot syntax. This is the operator. So and we're looking with the connect underscore error property. Using the procedural, you would be working with the function, and you could test to see whether it returns true or false. Another common statement that is used in determining if we have an error, and if we do, how to handle it, is with what is called a try-catch statement. So in the try clause, we are setting up our connection, and we have an echo if it's successful. In the catch, we're going to handle that error in the event that it occurs. And here I have the syntax with the PDO object. Once we have the connection to the database, we need to determine what we want to retrieve. This is where your SQL statement comes in, most typically a select statement. And remember, I talked about getting rid of those tick marks that PHP MyAdmin puts in, because it's a lot easier to work with it in your PHP code without all those quotes. So supposing we wanted to select the first name and the last name from the members table, we have already opened a connection to that database. So now we store our SQL statement in a variable. And what we're going to do, we're going to execute that query using the connection object and store it in a variable, which is essentially your result set. So here, using the MySQL object-oriented approach, we have the connection object. We're passing it the parameter, which is our SQL statement. The next example, MySQL procedural, we're using the MySQL underscore query function, passing it two things, two parameters. The first parameter is the connection object. The second is the SQL. The PDO has a different syntax. Here, this is also object-oriented, and we're executing the prepare method on the connection object, passing it the SQL variable, which holds the SQL statement. In all three instances, we are getting a result set. If you were to be using a where clause in your SQL statement, MySQL object-oriented and procedural is the same SQL statement regardless. Nothing has changed. However, in PDO, we do need to execute it differently using the bind value method. So in the event that we had a where clause, supposing we wanted to see where the city equaled a certain city, we would not hard code the name of that city in as we normally would do, but we would give it a placeholder here, preceded by a colon. It can be whatever word we wish. That's a variable, essentially. We would still need to obtain the result set. Then we would need to bind that value to the literal that we were looking for and put that into the result set also. What we do is we go into PHP we work with the database and the tables that we're going to be working with in our web page, and we go in and we execute the SQL just like we have learned to do thus far. You want to test to make sure that you're getting the right results back, and when you see the records returned, there is a link for creating the PHP code. However, it's pretty much the same as the SQL code that you've already executed. The only difference is that they're storing it in a variable, and notice they're escaping those tick marks. So as I said, remove all those things. The only thing that needs to be quoted is a literal value. You do not need quotes around your fields or your tables. It's always a good idea to test that you have some results. There are several ways of doing that. One is to see if you have some rows. In MySQL Object-Oriented, there is the num_rows property that we can call, execute on the result set. In the MySQL procedural, there is a function that we can pass to the result set. In PDO Object-Oriented, there is a method that we can call. You also can use the traditional PHP count function. Ultimately, we are returning a result set as an associative array, and we need to loop through it to actually see all of the results. So for MySQL Object-Oriented, we're looking at the fetch_ASOC method being executed on the result set inside a while loop. For the MySQL procedural, we have another function being executed inside a while loop. PDO Object-Oriented is a little different. We first need to use the fetch_all method on that result set, store that in a variable, and using a for each, loop through the results. You would typically, inside the code, be placing those values inside some HTML code, be it a table row or some other HTML tags. And this is an example using MySQL Object-Oriented. So we would be looping through all of the records and using their field names to echo back the data for every row.